Hello people, let's unravel the French Revolution. In 1789, in the wake of early morning, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. Rumors spread that the king would open fire upon the citizens. People started gathering and they started breaking into a number of government buildings in search of arms. The commander of the Bastille was killed in the armed fight and the prisoners were released. People hated the Bastille as it stood for the despotic power of the king. People protested against the high price of bread. A new chain of events began which led to the execution of the king in France. Let's start with the French society during the late 18th century. Louis XVI in 1774 ascended the throne of France. Financial France was drained because of the war. France, under the Louis XVI, helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from Britain. Taxes were increased to meet regular expenses such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, and the running government offices or universities. The country of France was divided into three estates. In the 18th century, the feudal system was part of the society estates dated back to the Middle Ages. 90% of the population was dominated by the peasants, but only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. 60% was owned by nobles, the church, and other richer members of the third estate. The clergy and the nobility, members of the first two estates, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. These group of members were exempted from paying taxes and enjoyed feudal privileges. All members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state, which included a direct tax called taille and a number of indirect taxes which were levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. The struggle to survive. An increase in population led to a rapid increase in food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, due to which the price of bread rose rapidly. Due to the low wages paid to the laborers, the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. A growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. Peasants used to participate in revolts against taxes and food scarcity. The group of the Third Estate had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. In the 18th century, new social groups emerged, termed the middle class, who earned their wealth through expanding overseas trade and by manufacturing woolen and silk textiles that were either exported or bought by the richer members of the society. The Third Estate included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. A person's social position was dependent on their merit. All these groups were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. A new form of government was proposed by Rousseau based on a social contract between people and their representatives. Similarly, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. In the US, this model of government was put into force. Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to meet the expenses. Now let's understand the outbreak of the revolution. In France, the monarch didn't have the power to impose taxes. They had to call a meeting of the Estates General, a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives, to pass proposals for new taxes. Louis XVI on 5th May 1789 called an assembly to pass proposals for the new taxes. Representatives from the first and the second estates were present, and the third estate was represented by its prosperous and educated members. According to the principle of each estate had one vote. But representatives from the third estate demanded each member would have one vote. The demand was rejected, so members of the third estate walked out to protest. They swore not to disperse till a constitution was drafted for France that would limit the powers of the monarch. Due to the severe winter, bread prices rose and people had to spend hours in long queues. Rumors spread that the lords of manor hired bands of brigands to destroy the ripe crops. In fear, peasants started looting hoarded grains and burned down documents containing records of manorial dues. Nobles fled from their homes. Louis XVI accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be checked by a constitution. The Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes on 4th of August 1789. Taxes were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. In 1791, the National Assembly completed the draft of the constitution, and its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers were now separated and assigned to different institutions: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. France became a constitutional monarchy. Citizens voted for a group of electors, who in turn chose the assembly. But unfortunately, not every citizen had the right to vote. Men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of labor's wage were entitled to vote. The Constitution began with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and equality before the law were established as natural and inalienable rights. That is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. Let's move to the time when France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. In April 1792, the National Assembly voted for a war against Prussia and Austria. Marshes became the national anthem of France. While men were away fighting in the war, women took care of their families. Large sections of population demanded that the revolution had to be carried out further. As the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of the society. Political clubs were formed, and among them, Jacobians became the most successful ones. Members of the Jacobean Club included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Jacobean members started wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by the dock workers. These Jacobians were called the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without the knee breeches. On August 10, 1792, Jacobians stormed to the Palace of Versailles and held the king hostage for several hours. Elections were held and all men of 21 years and above got the right to vote. Monarchy was abolished on 21st of September 1792 and France was declared a republic. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. The Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. People whom Robespierre saw as enemies of the Republic were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. If they were declared guilty by the court, then they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded, named after Dr. Guillotin. Laws were issued to place a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Expensive wheat flour was forbidden to use. Equality was practiced through forms of speech and addresses. All men and women were addressed as Citon and Citon, that literally means citizen. In July 1794, he was convicted, by a court arrested, and the next day sent to be dead. A Directory ruled France. The fall of the Jacobean government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize the power. According to the new constitution, non-propertied sections of the society denied voting. It provided for two elected legislative councils. The government appointed a directory consisting of executives made up of 5 members. Political instability paved the way for a military dictator, Napoleon. Did women have a revolution? Women were active participants from the beginning, which brought important changes in the country of France. Women from the third estate had to work for a living and they didn't have access to education or job training. Daughters of nobles of the third estate were allowed to study at a convent. Working women also had to care for their families. Compared to men, their wages were lower. Women also started their political clubs and newspapers. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was one of the most famous women's clubs. They demanded equal political rights as men, the right to vote and to hold political office. The revolutionary government introduced the laws to improve the lives of women. Schooling became compulsory, divorce was made legal, and they could run their own small businesses. During the Reign of Terror, the government closed women's clubs, banning their political activities. After much struggle, women in France in 1946 won the right to vote. How did the abolition of slavery actually happen? Jacobean regime's most revolutionary social reform was the abolition of slavery in French colonies. In the 17th century, the slave trade began. Slaves were bought from local chieftains, branded, and were packed tightly into ships for 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Slave labor met the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. In 1794, the convention legislated to free all the slaves in the French overseas possessions. Napoleon introduced slavery after 10 years. In 1848, slavery was abolished in French colonies. The Revolution and everyday life. France during 1789 saw changes in the lives of men, women, and children. Abolition of censorship happened in summer of 1789. Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Freedom of the press meant opposing views of events could be expressed. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large number of people. Let's conclude everything that we discussed today. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in what? 1804, and introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom to create a sovereign nation state. With this, we have wrapped an interesting portion of our curriculum. Stay tuned for more amazing content. Thank you.